the idea of debugging has changed the culture of learning mathematics in the elementary classrooms. So typically, students might see math, you get the right answer or you get the wrong answer. The way debugging has changed the approach math is it's okay not to get the right answer the first time because we can go back and debug it, right? What steps were wrong and how can we fix the errors that we had in the steps we took to come to the answer that they had, right? And so that's huge, right? Even though our goal was to use computational thinking as an on-ramp to bring more computer science in the classroom, this finding that teachers are using CT as a metacognitive approach, right? So providing kids with opportunities to think about their own thinking, right? That's been huge.
I'm Nikki Herda, and this is Bright, Stories of Hope and Innovation in Michigan Classrooms, a podcast where we celebrate our state's educators and explore the future of learning. When you think of debugging, you probably don't think of math problems. Similarly, when you hear the term computational thinking, the first thing that comes to mind probably isn't a high school art classroom. But there are parallels here, and the field of computer science has more to offer educators than meets the eye. Computational thinking is a concept that has been making waves in K-12 education since 2006. It's a term originally coined by MIT professor Seymour Papert, who described how computers offer us tools to think with. In today's episode, I chat with Dr. Amin Yadav, professor of educational psychology and educational technology at Michigan State University, who shares his insights on the rich applications of both plugged and unplugged computational thinking for the K-12 classroom, and sheds light on the lesser-known field of justice-oriented computer science and the biased algorithms that govern our everyday lives. Thank you, Amin, for joining us today. I was wondering, to kick us off, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
So thanks for having me. I'm a professor in the College of Education in the Educational Psychology and Educational Technology program. Broadly, I do research and teach courses within our Educational Technology Master's program and our doctoral program in EdPsych and EdTech. And my research focuses on how elementary school teachers, middle school teachers can bring computational thinking and computer science into their classrooms, primarily to support disciplinary learning. So at the elementary level, we have a project called CT for EDU that we're working with teachers to bring computational thinking into their math and science instruction. And again, the goal is to use CT, computational thinking, to enhance students' learning and understanding of mathematical and scientific ideas. At the middle school level, the project is called ICT. If you add like I in front of anything, it becomes cool, like iPhone or iPad. We added an I, brought a vowel. So within that project, we're working with middle school teachers to bring computational thinking into social studies, English language arts, and arts. So 3 disciplines at the middle school level. And often when we think about computing, we don't think about how does that intersect within those 3 disciplines. So broadly, so teach courses in computer science education and do research in computer science education.
So you are, a computational thinking expert, but maybe not everybody listening has heard that term before. So how would you define the term computational thinking? How do you describe it around the dinner table or to the educators that you're speaking to who aren't familiar?
I think if you talk to 10 people like me, you might get 10 different definitions of what computational thinking is and how we should do it. So that's a great question. The idea of computational thinking has been around since 1980s. When Seymour Papert, who was at MIT, talked about how computers can be used as a tool to think with. It's gained popularity within K-12 education and higher education since 2006, after Jeanette Wing published an article on computational thinking, right? So broadly, I would define computational thinking as a set of practices that computer scientists draw upon in their work and something that everything should learn. So practices like algorithm design and debugging, right? So if I talk to somebody who might not know what an algorithm is, and then that's happened in some of my conversations with teacher, I hear, oh, that's math, right? Or that's science. I don't do that, right? But designing an algorithm really means, developing a step-by-step instructions to solve a problem. And debugging involves fixing and finding errors when those steps don't lead to a desired solution. So within computer science, an example is, when we write code and it doesn't work, we debug it, right? We go back and fix it so we can get the desired output. But we also write algorithms in our daily lives when we write a recipe, to cook something, and then we tweak the recipe to get the desired taste that we want, right? So that's algorithm design and debugging, like two of the practices in computer science or that are within computational thinking.
But you're kind of saying, you can take this framework or this way of thinking, these processes, and you can apply it to a variety of different problems. You could take it, you're expanding it into the art classroom and the ELA classroom. Have you seen any interesting projects that have emerged from that? Like, I know you said you guys are starting that out, but an ELA or an art teacher using this and computational thinking in their classroom.
So one of the goals of computational thinking is to bring more computationally rich experiences into the classroom. Right? We can't just say that, just use algorithms and computational thinking is done. You're done with computer science, right? So that's one of the fears that I do have, that we just don't want computational thinking to serve as a checkbox for computer science experiences, right? We want teachers to bring more computationally rich experiences. So an example within art might look like teachers using physical computing devices like Arduinos to have lights and movement into their art projects, right? So it's not just a 3D project, it's a 4D project, so to speak, because kids are using in art classrooms and creating these sculptures that can play music, that have sensors, that if you bring your hand near their face, they move, right? Because there's a light sensor there. And so they have those, motors that allow them to move. So I think that's an example of how computational thinking could be used to enhance art projects and art instruction.
Very cool. And then the student, I presume, learns kind of how to do that, program it, to the right, whatever it might be to go with that project.
Yeah.
Awesome.
But it also goes back to that, they're using computational tools and devices and practices for their personal agency and express their creativity.
So what advice would you give to a K-12 teacher if they were interested, they're intrigued by this concept, it's a little bit new to them, but they want to try it out in their classroom? Where would you advise that they start?
Get in touch with us. I'm only half kidding. I know I love working with teachers. I learn a lot from working with teachers and being in classrooms, and it keeps me grounded in problems of practice that teachers face. So we need one thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that teachers are supported in bringing computational thinking into their classroom, and it's not an add-on to an already overburdened teacher, right? We need to make sure that computational thinking is used to support their disciplinary learning goals, right? How can CT support their students learning in the content areas that they're teaching, right? Whether that's through using a computing device, or without one. So with a computing device, the term is plugged computational thinking, and without a computing device is unplugged computational thinking. So I believe for teachers to be able to bring CT into their classroom, it's important to first explore what are the CT practices, right? What does it mean to design an algorithm, to debug? What does it mean to decompose, something, right? So decomposition is another CT practice. Is how do you break a complex problem down into smaller, more manageable parts, right? So within math, a teacher could then start using decomposition as a way to help their students solve math problems, right? How can we break this complex math problem into smaller, more manageable problems that might be easier to solve, right? And to be able to do that, it's first important to take a deep dive in what these practices are and how they intersect with what your learning goals are within whatever discipline that you want to bring CT in. And then I think once teachers start seeing connections between CT and their disciplinary learning goals, we also want to push their thinking to bring more computing-rich experiences or computationally rich experiences in the classroom. So students then also see how these CT practices are used within the context of programming, right? Or using physical computing devices.
And so, from your perspective, either doing it yourself or just working with teachers who've tried this out in the classroom, what is it that students walk away with, that is so exciting?
Yeah.
How does it, how do they walk away, improved or having a different way of thinking?
Yeah. So I'll give an example of an unplugged, so not using a computing device and a plugged. What are the benefits of bringing CT through both of those? So in our work with teachers, the idea of debugging has changed the culture of learning mathematics in the elementary classrooms. So typically, students might see math, you get the right answer or you get the wrong answer. The way debugging has changed the approach math is it's okay not to get the right answer the first time because we can go back and debug it, right? What steps were wrong and how can we fix the errors that we had in the steps we took to come to the answer that they have, right? And so that's huge, right? Even though our goal was to use computational thinking as an on-ramp to bring more computer science in the classroom, this finding that teachers are using CT as a metacognitive approach, right? So providing kids with opportunities to think about their own thinking, right? That's been huge, and that's an interesting finding, has implications for them learning math, literacy, science, right? We still need those skills. It's not just all about computer science. From a plugged computational thinking perspective, I think as teachers bring, using Scratch programming environment to teach a math problem, right? Or for students to explore a math idea, kids interacting with code, writing the code, or using an existing starter code, the aha moments that they have, that they can use computer, and not only use computer as an object to think with, as Seymour Papert would say, but also they can manipulate the objects on the computer, right? That's exciting, right? And the excitement and the engagement in the classroom when a student debugs a code and gets it to work, that's phenomenal.
It's interesting to me because I recently spoke to another teacher that's going to be on the podcast, and I'll ask you this question soon, but I asked her about her favorite teacher, and she spoke about a math teacher that taught her it was okay to get the problem wrong. So she remembered a specific instance in, I think, 7th grade when the math, her math teacher explained to her, it's okay if you get it wrong the first time. And that was eye-opening to her, right? Because it's as you described, a lot of kids think with math, for whatever reason, you have to get it right the first time. So it's cool to hear, that you're working to expand that experience for kids all over the state.
As I said earlier, that's been an interesting finding for us that we didn't expect, right? We're still using CT as an on-ramp for computer science, but it's having all these benefits for kids learning in the disciplines that teachers are implementing CT. And I think, the role that standardized testing has played, and that you need to get the right answer the first time, right, plays into kids and teachers feeling pressure to, make sure that kids solve the problem the right way. But I think if we just approach the way that our teachers and students are approaching math now and how it's changed the culture of learning math, I think that will naturally lead to increases in math score. So one of our teacher partners, we're collaborating with teachers in Oakland, schools in Oakland County here in Michigan. She sent a note that her math scores on the standardized testing went up, right, since she started implementing computational thinking in her classroom. That's a huge result, right? And very important result.
I'm Nikki Herda, and you're listening to Bright, a podcast that's made possible by Michigan Virtual, a nonprofit organization that's leading and collaborating to build learning environments for tomorrow. Today, I'm chatting with Dr. Amin Yadav, a professor of educational psychology and educational technology at Michigan State University, whose research focuses on bringing computational thinking into K-12 education. Up next, we chat about a topic that was new to me, justice-oriented computer science and its applications for the K-12 classroom. Another passion area that you mentioned was justice-oriented computer science. So I've never heard of that before. I was wondering, I'm sure there are others who have not either. Can you tell us what that's all about and what applications it has in the K-12 classroom?
Yeah, there are two aspects to justice-oriented computer science that I think about. One of them is broadening participation into computer science. So we have more women and students of color pursuing computer science. Right. So I think we have done a great job. We're not there yet, but we continue to build by increasing number of women and Black and brown students that are taking computer science in our state, in Michigan, but also across the country. But how do we continue to do that? So one of the ways I mentioned earlier of the benefits of computer science, it allows students that personal agency and express their creativity. Right? We can build on that in computer science by leveraging and bringing students' experiences, lived experiences, and the communities they live in by centering that into computer science classrooms. So engaging community partners, families, and students into the design of the CS curriculum and teaching of the CS curriculum. The second part of justice-oriented computer science, we need to address the colorblind racism that exists in the computing industry. So how are discrimination and biases that structure our larger society are coded into technologies? So an example is when the artificial intelligence in Google face recognition photo services organizes photo of Black youth into a folder called Gorillas, right? So that's an example of how colorblind racism and bias and discrimination are baked into those technologies. So we need to re-examine the basic assumptions of how technologies are designed, implemented, and the role computer science plays in the design and implementation of those technologies. So we need to bring criticality to computer science in K-12 classrooms. So kind of like summarizing, we need to center students' lived experiences, and we need to bring criticality to computer science on the role of computer science in perpetuating this racism in society.
So for the K-12 classroom, do you think, in part, it's just making students aware of these sorts of things? Because I think it's just so easy I think people tend to assume that the algorithm is unbiased, just because it's a computer, that there isn't a bias.
When we think of a computer, a computer and algorithm that's running behind it, how could it be biased, right? but there are plenty of examples how computers, like facial recognition technology, is biased towards people of color, right? It misidentifies Black and brown people. So when we assume that algorithms are not biased and people continue to use them, but those algorithms and those technologies continue to oppress and harm Black and brown communities, we need to address it, right? We need to educate and make students that are studying computer science aware of this. So how is an algorithm designed for sentencing, for prison, is biased towards Black and brown men and gives sentencing guidelines to judges that puts Black and brown men in jail and prison for more time as compared to white men for similar crimes, right? So that algorithm is biased, right? Because it's using racialized data, right? That is biased, right? Rua Benjamin is a scholar and has this great book, Race After Technology, that addresses many of these issues. And I think folks should definitely read that. Another book is Algorithms of Oppression by Safiya Noble that I think people should also read.
So this could get us down a rabbit hole, but we'll see. But is it in part just the issue of the machine or the algorithm inherits the bias of the creator, or is it also what you described where the data sets themselves, have bias and that's what the machine is inputting?
I think it's both. The racialized data that's being used to train those artificial intelligence algorithms is biased because it's racialized and gendered. But also people that are designing the technologies are mostly white and Asian males who don't have the same experiences that Black and brown men and women have had. So those biases come into the design of technologies. So I think I'd say it's both.
The first path that you described was about incorporating students' lived experiences. And you were talking about, incorporating the communities that they live in into the lessons, I think.
Yeah.
Can any concrete examples of that come to mind?
Yeah, my colleague, Michael Lachney, who's also a faculty here in EdSci and EdTech, and I and a couple of our graduate students have been thinking about what does the intersection of formal education and community-based design of computer science curriculum might look like, right? So one of the concrete things that teachers can do is to go beyond the walls of the school and be in community spaces where students live, right? And so I think that's one of the things that teachers need to do. They just can't drive into schools from suburbs to go to the classroom and teach and not be in those community spaces that students live. I think that's incredibly important. So an example of what culturally responsive computing that centers students and community in a computer science classroom might look like. My colleague, Michael Lachney, who's a faculty in our EdSci and EdTech program, wrote this piece on how CRC, culturally responsive computing, can be used within computer science classroom by making it meaningful both the students as well as the families and the communities. So the example that we give in that paper is of a high school computer science teacher and a cosmetologist collaborating together to using these culturally situated design tools to educate, to bring the cornrow curves and programming that using the culturally situated design tools, right? So again, it's bringing an example from students' lives into a formal computer science classroom, but then using a programming tool to, design, cornrow curves. Right? So that's an example of what that looks like.
Very cool. Thank you. I'm glad I asked. The other thought that I was having as you were describing this is, something that's also come up across, these interviews that I've conducted is, when it comes to equity in education, a big part of it is just giving exposure to students, to all students, not just those who have, are in higher socioeconomic areas or, in the city or the suburbs or in a private school or not, equal access to opportunity, right? And I think one thing that strikes me, I suppose, is that by incorporating this computational thinking in classrooms all over, you probably will naturally encourage more diversity and equity in computer science, because then other students, women and students of color, get the opportunity to participate at a young age and see that it is something that's available to them, as a career. So I think that's pretty good too.
Yeah, I think, increasing representation of Black and brown students in computer science at the K-12 level, at the undergraduate level is important. So we have increased representation in the computing industry, right? So I think the CT work does that, right? So when kids at elementary grade, engage in learning to code, they understand what algorithms are, what debugging is. Like as they move across K-12, computer science is not something that only certain kinds of kids do, right? Everybody can engage in thinking computationally and computer science. I think the other part that I did say in terms of like equity focused and justice oriented work, we can't just stop at increasing representation. We do need to address that colorblind racism that exists in computing industry that I mentioned earlier. By bringing that criticality to computer science in K-12 classrooms, right? And not just something folks study at the undergraduate level or graduate level.
I'm Nikki Herda, and you're listening to Bright, a podcast that's made possible by Michigan Virtual, a nonprofit organization that's leading and collaborating to build learning environments for tomorrow. Today, I'm chatting with Dr. Amin Yadav, a professor of educational psychology and educational technology at Michigan State University, whose research focuses on bringing computational thinking into K-12 education. Up next, we chat about Dr. Yadav's favorite teacher, his vision for student learning, and the systemic changes he hopes to see made in education. I was wondering if you could tell me about your favorite teacher and why they had such an impact on you.
So my favorite teacher was my high school English teacher. Even though I went into engineering, right? Then the reason she was my favorite teacher, and it's cliche to say that she was the first teacher who really provided me with the wings to fly and pursue the things I could pursue, right? And she had the way she treated me respectfully, right? I wasn't, I would say in early on in high school, I wasn't the hardest working kid, but I think she pushed my thinking in English, but I think that transferred to other areas within in high school too, right? She saw something in me. I grew up in India. I went to high school and undergraduate in India, and she gave me more responsibilities in ways that pushed me to do better in high school, and then that led to undergraduate and master's and PhD. I didn't think my parents thought I would be getting a master's and a PhD and be a full professor when I was in high school, but I attribute that to my high school English teacher. Mrs. Sharma.
Thank you. Man, I love that question and I love the answers I get. It's just good stuff, you know?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can tell me, this is another big question, but about your vision for student learning. So the way I break that down a little bit is just to say, if it were up to you, what would you want to see for every student?
Computer science is important and it plays a huge role in my work. So certainly I do believe that we need all students' exposure to computer science. But if I had to pick, computer science doesn't make the cut for all students learning in K-12. I think given what's happening in our society, it's important for all students to learn about the role, how we continue to oppress and harm Black and Brown communities, and the role of the structures that are in place in our society, right? That continue to do that, right? So white supremacy is not just Ku Klux Klan and people marching with tiki torches. It's a system of oppression that harms and oppresses Black and Brown communities more so than other people. So I think that needs to be part of our conversations at the K-12 and undergraduate level. I think as we start doing that, the criticality that I had mentioned in computer science will naturally get there, right? So I think that's what's important for all students to learn.
And I think, that does tie into what you've described with, that second branch of, I think you called it both justice-oriented CS and culturally responsive computing. Is that right?
Yeah.
But examining the algorithms, right? And I'm not an expert, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I did watch a video on computational thinking, so I at least kind of knew a little bit about your specialty before our interview, and it defined algorithm as a set of rules, and maybe that's too simplistic, but if you think of it that way, then there's a lot of algorithms that run our society too, right? And so that's maybe there is like kind of a tie in there. If you can understand how an algorithm could be biased, maybe you can understand how something more abstract like laws and governance might also fall to the same sort of biases.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's a great point.
What words of advice or encouragement would you offer to educators right now?
That's a hard question because I think we need systemic change in how we treat educators in this country, and not just say hollow words of encouragement, because that's all we have and that's all what we can give teachers. Over the last 16 months, teachers have done an incredible job of supporting our students in the classroom. I'm amazed at everything that they did this past year. So I just don't want to say, words that might come across as like, here's more words for encouragement, right? I think we need to take concrete steps to, one, treat educators and teachers with respect and as professionals who know what's happening in their classrooms, and not just babysit my kids, open schools so I can go to work or whatever, right? I think the federal government and the state government need to, get teachers' voice in the room and at the table where decisions are being made, and politicians are not making decisions, or school boards are not making decisions when they do not have a background in the classroom and have never stepped foot inside the classroom. I learn a lot from teachers, working with teachers, collaborating with teachers, being in classroom spaces. Like the happiest days of my work are when I'm in a classroom, just seeing teachers in action. So thank you to all the teachers. You're amazing. I'm a big fan of public education and teachers. Teachers have made, as I said, made a huge difference in my life. So it's important that we recognize the work that teachers do. So that's all I have to say. Treat teachers with respect, treat them as professionals and people that know what's going on in their classroom, because they are the ones at the front lines.
I suppose it makes sense. In a world transformed by each leap in computing power and increasingly governed by codes and algorithms, that the field of computer science itself might have a lot to teach us about how to think. Dr. Amin Yadav offers some fascinating examples of how computational thinking and justice-oriented computer science can bring new perspectives into the K-12 classroom. For example, by showing students how they can write code to program beautiful art pieces, or how algorithms can actually inherit the bias of their creators, or how the process of debugging can make complex math problems just a little less frightening. Without a doubt, there's a lot to unpack here, and a lot of work left to be done. But with leaders like Amin forging our path forward, if there's one thing we're certain of, it's that the future is bright. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Bright, Stories of Hope and Innovation in Michigan Classrooms. This podcast is produced by Herbie Gaylord, is hosted by me, Nikki Herda, and is shaped by many of our passionate and talented colleagues. Big thanks to Krista Green, Ann Perez, Ann Kraft, and Brandon Batista for their contributions to this episode. The Bright podcast is made possible by Michigan Virtual, a nonprofit organization that's leading and collaborating to build learning environments for tomorrow. Education is changing faster than ever. Discover new models and resources to move learning forward at your school at michiganvirtual.org.